Good evening. Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Katie Yates, and it's my pleasure to introduce MDIFW's wildlife biologist, game bird specialist, Kelsey Sullivan. Tonight, Kelsey will be giving us a presentation on the ecology of Maine's wild turkeys. At the end of the presentation, we will be taking some audience questions. And as always, this stream is being recorded and will be available on the department's YouTube channel. Kelsey, I will let you take it from here.
Thanks, Katie. I guess I will share my screen. It says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Go ahead and try now.
Okay. Oh. Sorry. Starting again. All good to go, Katie? Okay, thanks. All right, welcome to Thursday night, 6:30 at the Sullivan household. Today I'm going to present a wild turkey story, and it really is a story. And to start the story, you have to start with the history of the wild turkey, going back before European settlement. And then I'll kind of walk you through that, and then some of the things that we've been doing specific to research for wild turkey in Maine, and then how that will apply and is applying to conservation and management. So this is where the story begins. So of course, with any story, there's an origin story. So wild turkey, the wild turkey fossil record, this artistic depiction of the ancestral form was found. The fossil was found 2 to 3 million years ago in Texas and Kansas. So that's the form that is where our wild turkey came from. Of course, following ancient history, when people started to come onto the landscape, there was several uses for wild turkey in indigenous cultures. Feathers, of course, in dress, in ceremony. Other parts of the turkey were used. The bone was used for awls and needles, for piercing deer hide and stitching water bags together. And maybe, I didn't have an awl or a needle to show you, but I have a wild turkey wing bone caul that someone carved for me, that potentially American Indians may have used those for hunting. Another thing that's kind of interesting that these cultures used turkeys for were what's called IPM, or integrated pest management, which at the time probably wasn't coined, that phrase wasn't coined, but basically using turkeys on their cultivated landscape gardens and habitat to reduce insect pests, so ticks and other things. And then I have food in a smaller font because my understanding is wild turkeys weren't used primarily, or were used for food, but to a lesser extent than other game. They were utilized when other game was scarce. So, you know, they had other uses, this IPM use, which they wanted to keep them on the landscape, so only utilizing them for food when was necessary. So, of course, we've transitioned from ancient times to indigenous cultures prior to European settlement. And when folks came across on the Mayflower, even prior to that, when they set foot in North America, they had no reference, or they had not seen a bird this size and this, a bird on the landscape like this. They had some reference from the old world, and that's found in the name where wild turkey, the Latin name, comes from. Meleagris galopavo sylvestris, which The root is guinea peafowl. So from the old world, they did have birds that were upland gallinaceous birds, a lot smaller, and they found these birds in the forest. So that's the root of the Latin name. Another thing to step back, as we step back and look at European settlement, this is likely what most of the landscape looked like. Forested, there was small patches of open ground, but a mix of forest and openings that wild turkeys do well in. They require different features on the landscape, not just clearing and not forest. So having both is turkeys do well in. So of course, European settlement, with European settlement came pretty significant clearing for farm fields across the landscape. If you had an aerial image of Bangor right now, the Bangor area or anywhere in New England really, most of where settlement was completely cleared for farming. So you combine that with hunting, but the hunting back then was really different than what it is now. It was unregulated. So market hunting existed for turkeys for their feathers, for dress, and but also for food. And so with those two things of changing significantly the habitat that they require and unregulated hunting, that equaled this giant word, which extirpation is really what it means. Is there was something existed in the past but didn't exist anymore. So right around the late 1800s, wild turkeys didn't exist in Maine anymore. So how we got to where we are today with turkeys was a combination of several different things, changes in the landscape and actions. Number one really was the transition for the economy from the industrial revolution, which actually equaled a positive thing for wild turkeys and other wildlife species, where farms were abandoned and we saw more forest regeneration. So creating habitat that would support wild turkey and other wildlife. This was a pretty significant act, 1937, the Federal Aid and Wildlife Restoration Act, or otherwise known as Pittman-Robertson or PR funds. And this, an excise tax was placed on firearms, ammunition, and I believe hunting equipment, 11%. So any dollar spent, 11% went towards wildlife conservation and management. And many folks probably know now, hopefully they know, but our department is funded, a significant amount of our funds come from this Pittman-Robertson Act. So we're able to do work on all kinds of different species from this excise tax. So that was part of the stage that was setting. We also had post-World War II, when folks were coming back from the war, there was a workforce ready to go. There was an interest in restoration. And then the above 1937 Act, there was money to restore things, to work on wildlife. The wildlife biology profession really kind of started off. I mean, it was there prior, but it really started to form once you had funding and interest. And then set the stage for wild turkey restoration. And note here, between 1940 and early 1970, there was a lot of effort to try to bring wild turkey back to not only Maine, but a lot of different states that didn't have them anymore. Some states still had some refuge of wild turkeys, but for the most part, they were gone for many of New England states and other states. And I say fits and starts because a lot of the effort was focused on raising wild turkey in captivity and then releasing them. And what happened was that they really didn't retain the wildness they needed to survive and thrive out in the wild. So that went on for a number of decades until something significant happened, and wild turkeys returned to Maine, and it was the advent or the adoption of this tool, cannon or rocket nets were used to trap birds. And then from other states that still had some turkeys that were willing to part with what they had to help other states restore their populations. And then catch them and move them up to different places. So what this picture is going to, I have a little video, hopefully it'll play, but this is a group of turkeys. This obviously isn't 1970, but maybe it isn't. But birds would get accustomed to bait piles, and then you can see in the bottom of the screen, there's a box, and that's packed with a net. And then there's 3 projectile rockets, basically a pipe bomb packed with black powder attached to a net. And once turkeys get accustomed to it after a few days and they become regular, then folks go out and sit in a blind and wait for them to come and press a button. And then I'm hoping this will play and people can see it, but you try to time it so when a good number of turkeys are there, and you shoot a net over them, catch them, and then a bunch of folks run out and box them up, band them, and move them up to wherever they're going to go. So like you said, trap and transfer was really the key, and the rocket net was the key as well. So this is just some specs about how we ended up with what we have now. 1977 and 1978, we received 41 wild turkeys from Vermont. Restoration started down in southern Maine in York County, the towns of York and Elliott. Eventually, after a few years, the population was large enough that we could start to do a trap and transfer within state. So turkeys did really well in York County. And so in 1982 through 84, department biologists and the National Wildlife Turkey Federation and volunteers grouped together and started moving birds up to Waldo and Hancock counties. Then in 1987 and 1988, just to kind of give the population an extra charge, we received 70 turkeys from Connecticut. And then this trap and transfer program continued for other parts of the state, northern Maine and down east, up until 2011, when populations were deemed established. So we are not actively trapping and transferring birds for repopulation anymore. So that leads us to this slide of all the counties in Maine, and you can go to any county in Maine and have the potential to see a turkey. I know we've had reports up by Clayton Lake, northern Aroostook County, northwestern Somerset, Piscataquis, north of Greenville. So they're pretty widely distributed, not necessarily in the same numbers. This is the core range really that we think of when we think of abundant population. So, and for those turkey hunters, you probably can see that matches the fall seasons pretty tightly because of the densities of turkeys that we have in that core range. I'm going to whip through these 2 slides really quick. I just want to demonstrate that there's, from 1977 until today, there's been a lot of slow, conservative steps to establish the population that we have now. So there's been a lot of assessments and decisions and actions to promote and to restore the population that we have. So I'm not going to read through every bullet here, but a lot of there's trap and transfer, hunting regulation expansions, and different management plans and goals and objectives. Continues on through early 2000s, and then I highlight 2016 and 17 as sort of in terms of wild turkey management in Maine, a transition from restoring to a restored population to a stable population where in many parts of the state they're considered abundant. And you see that quote, "Turkeys are everywhere," which as a turkey biologist, you hear that quite a bit in the fall when there's been a pretty good year for production for wild turkeys. So I just wanted to note that in 2016 and 17, we've transitioned from that restoration phase to managing an abundant species, and all that entails. And I note responsive management big game survey and Maine's big game management plan, and I'll kind of cover those more in depth in the next few slides. So in 2017, the department, along with several folks from the public and different interest groups, met for a number of meetings over a year. There was some steering groups, subcommittees for the different big game species, and finalizing a big game management plan to direct the department for the next 10 to 15 years. And fortunately, turkeys still maintain a status as a big game species. So wild turkeys were included in this plan. As I noted, there was public input and various interest groups that informed the big game management plan. And these were based on questions that we had, or one aspect of it was asking the public and landowners and hunters and the general public questions about perceptions and opinions on wild turkey management, population, and other aspects of the wild turkey resource. So one of the questions was, how would you rate wild turkey management in Maine? We got a 70% rating, or excellent or good, which if you look across the country, that's not too bad of a rating. And I think if you note the next question, what would you like the wild turkey population size to do? So this is kind of getting at that turkeys are everywhere question. But 60% of the folks that responded or participated in these surveys and public information sessions wanted to see the turkey population stay the same. 10% would like to see an increase, and 30% would like to see a decrease. And there's a lot of reasons why these questions came out the way they did, or the answers to these questions. You'd ask yourself, well, 30% decrease, who are those folks? Why are we? And you know, there's definitely issues with turkeys on the landscape with landowners and crops and agriculture. But it was interesting to note that 30% included a good number of hunters, and I think that was fueled by some of the perception that wild turkeys are a detriment to other wildlife species. And that's probably another whole presentation that we could go over, but I think that's where that 30% comes from. But overall, I would say that, but you could see that the 30% decrease probably informed that first question. So if you want to decrease and you're not happy with the population, you're likely going to rate management as below, excellent, or good. Some other questions were specific to turkey hunting, to see the perception and perspective of across the state on support for legal turkey hunting for population management, and we got a pretty high rating, 92 to 99%. And there's a range here because it's broken up into the different survey groups, hunters, landowners, and general public. So it varied between those three, between 92 and 99%. Turkey hunters themselves were pretty satisfied with their turkey hunting. And of course, satisfaction isn't necessarily bagging a turkey or successfully getting a turkey in the season. It's more, as many turkey hunters know, the experience. So, you know, we felt that was really good ratings for turkey hunting anyway. So going back to the big game management plan and charting the course for the department. So just want to reiterate that the goals that were formed out of this big game management plan were formed from a lot of different perspectives and interests. So not just the department dictating what the department should do, but many folks that participated in charting the course for wild turkey management. So, and though out of that, there's 4 pretty strong, important goals. Number 1, sustainable population through research and management. Second goal, to address social carrying capacity. As folks see around the state, there's lots of turkeys in different parts of the year and different parts of the state. But turkeys need acceptance from society to be at the levels that we have now, or to be at the levels that are acceptable. And that's really dictated by us, by people, and the majority. Another goal that came out was to promote wild turkey hunting, as the value of wild turkey hunting. And at the time, and still, the department and other folks felt like the wild turkey resource was underutilized, and there was room for more opportunity, and promoting that was part of the overall goal. And then, of course, to maintain acceptance and understanding, and because society drives the goals of different wildlife species, outreach and education on turkey biology, ecology, and management was pretty important. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to really cover this first goal, which really was the basis, or sort of the foundation for supporting the rest of the goals, was getting some information, some baseline information on wild turkeys, and specific to Maine. So just talking about that goal of a sustainable population, using research to inform our management. These are some 5 objectives are identified to address this goal. To stabilize wild turkey populations in portions of southern and central Maine, recognizing that these are areas where turkeys are abundant, and the majority of folks that rated management lower or wanted to see fewer turkeys came out of this part of the state. So that's trying to address potentially, or from the social perspective, overabundant turkeys. And number 2, we did identify as a group, there was areas in the state where we could increase the size and distribution of the turkey population, where they aren't as abundant, and there aren't as there is potential for population growth. Objective 3, to develop and improve techniques to monitor wild turkey population trends. And that's where the research comes into play, which I'm going to cover after this slide. But so informing management through better data, and then maintaining and improving the quality of our wild turkey harvest data. That is just probably an ongoing objective that we'll always aspire to have high quality harvest data that will help us better manage turkeys. And then the cornerstone for wild turkey hunting specifically, we're talking about wild turkey as a resource for hunting, is to maintain the wild turkey spring hunt. And measuring quality is through safety and hunter interference, and overall season satisfaction. So the research priorities that we identified, that we really wanted to get more information specific to Maine wild turkeys. There's a lot of research out there on wild turkeys. We recognize that, but Maine is at the northern end of their range. Our climate is somewhat different from a lot of the places where data has been collected and research has been done. So we felt that to really inform our management going forward, we wanted to get baseline wild turkey biology information. So we wanted to look at nesting, habitat use, and then how turkeys move across the landscape. Do they transition between wildlife management districts, for one. Understanding annual survival, which goes into our harvest management, harvest rates, to make sure that these are sustainable over time, and developing methods to continually assess those harvest rates. Disease is a pretty important aspect of wild turkey ecology and survival. And as many folks may remember, in 2012, we saw a significant outbreak of some disease lesions on turkeys' heads. We got a lot of reports across the state. So understanding the role of disease in our turkey population is important. And then ultimately, or not ultimately, but one important aspect is population estimation, and specifically at the wildlife management district level, so that we potentially can manage at a finer scale than just the state. And this all, of course, is going into our overall objective is to conserve and manage wild turkeys into the future. So the research project started in 2018, and it will be completed this year with the finalization of the report. This is the title from our report, and we have a 120-page report for anybody that's interested. I can share that with you. It's got a lot of good information on turkey biology. But the title of the report is Population Estimation, Harvest Management, and Landscape Scale Spatial Ecology of Wild Turkeys in Maine, which basically means understanding what turkeys are doing across the state, how they're utilizing habitat, and then at what level they are, and then how we can apply that to better harvest management. And the work wouldn't have been possible without our department, but also the University of Maine. There's 2 professors and 2 PhD candidates that were part of the project. And you know, those folks were big drivers for the success of the project. And of course, National Wildlife Turkey Federation provided support for some of the equipment and technical assistance. So those 3 groups were the main drivers. There was a lot of other folks involved, but I also wanted to note that if we back up to that slide that I showed you of the stage that's set for wild turkey restoration, 1937 Pittman-Robertson Act, 75% of the funding for this research project came from that act, or from that source of funding. And that's administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service under the Wildlife Sport Fish and Restoration Program. So that's key to many wildlife species management and monitoring and research. So to answer a lot of those questions about nesting, timing of nesting, survival of both male and female turkeys, movement across the landscape, we utilize this technology, which is a time-honored technology for wildlife research, is using telemetry units, which basically allow us to monitor position and mortality. If a bird dies, we can pick up a certain signal and then track to the unit and try to discern the fate and reason for mortality, and just to track and measure annual survival. This particular unit is a GPS unit, so you can put this unit on the back of a bird and then go out periodically and just hold up a receiver and get a download of all the movement data that turkey has been doing for the last 2 weeks. And then you can plot that on a map and understand movements between and different habitats and across the landscape. The other method is VHF telemetry, where you actually have to go out and actively search for signals and track birds on a daily basis to understand survival. But I have some slides that kind of depict the information we get from the GPS units in a little bit. But so we identified a study area, and we had an interest in understanding different movements and use of 3 different types of landscapes. And you can see here The orange, blue, and green are the main study area, looking at 3 different landscapes. Exeter and Corinth is orange, which is northwest. That's agriculture, ag for short. Orono and Bangor is an urban setting, and the Stud Mill Road, for folks that aren't familiar, is sort of a mini version of the North Maine Woods. It's a forested landscape utilized for commercial timber. So we wanted to look at the transition, the differences in use of those areas and potential transition across those areas. And then, for good measure, knowing that there's questions about season nesting and the differences between southern Maine and central Maine and northern Maine, we designed the study to include telemetry units put out in parts of southern Maine, specifically WMD 21 and a little bit in 16. So this is some of the cool information you get from GPS units. You go out and download data. All those, I don't know if I can see my cursor here. All these blue dots with black in the middle, this is all a location that was recorded on the unit and then downloaded. We received signal or location data on the hour between 7 a.m. and 5 p.m. daily. And this is all wintertime. So the capture site was probably the center of this blob. And then over the course of the winter, this is where this hen wild turkey was utilizing. And you can see for scale, this is about 6 miles down here. And then on about mid-April, you see a transition. So going from winter, and then this hen, within the course of a day and a half, she moves 6 miles to her pre-nesting area. So this is where she ended up nesting. So we see this a lot in most of our turkeys. The range, it can range quite a bit. Some birds, they'll winter and then 2 miles away they'll nest. Some will nest a mile away, and then some will nest pretty far. And this is a good example of the variation that we see in wild turkey movement. So we call this the 28-mile hen. She was captured in Munson, March of last year, and then she traveled. This is a 28-mile line, which she wouldn't have gone straight 28 miles. She would have wandered and moved, and she ended up nesting up in here west of Cacadjo. So that's good information for us in terms of assessing wildlife management district specific seasons and regulations. That, you know, it shows that wild turkeys are transitioning across pretty large landscapes, large distances, sometimes, not all the time, but that was pretty enlightening for me to see that distance that this female traveled. And it wasn't uncommon to see 10-mile distances from winter to breeding range, nesting range. So on to nesting. With those units, we can do a lot of different things. We were able to monitor 120 nests from birds with radios. That included GPS and the VHF. We got some good information on average dates of initiation, which was a really key question for season timing, whether or not we are timing our season to minimize our disruption to the breeding cycle of wild turkeys during their most vulnerable portion of their life cycle. And we found that, and these are first, second, and third attempts, so some birds that didn't succeed in hatching a clutch of eggs would attempt a second time. But on average, April 30th was when turkeys were initiating or laying their first egg. So, and that's close to our typical timing for the season. So those birds that failed, they tried again, or some did, not all of them, and they, on average, were initiating nests by May 31st. And then we did have one bird that tried twice before and finally pulled off a nest, or at least tried to pull off a third nest on June 23rd. Overall nest success was about 31%, and that's from nest initiation or first egg laid to hatch. It's about 38 days. So then I just wanted to share some of the kind of cool information that we gathered about habitat selection. The nesting sites varied quite a bit. This is a site down in Gray. It's about 70 yards from Route 115. You can hear cars zipping by, and it's in a patch of cattail surrounded by water. And you probably can't see it, but I'll let you try to figure out where the nest site is. So this is where the clutch of eggs was found, buried inside these cattails. Another nest, so this is quite a bit different from that cattail nest. This was in a patch of ferns. This hen nested late. You can see that it's already greened up. So this was probably towards the end of May when she was actually sitting on her nest. And that's her right there. So different strategies for habitat selection. And then, of course, you find nests that are out wide open, no overhead cover. This was a power line nest in a patch of juniper. And so nesting site selection varies quite a bit between individuals. I noted that we had a nest initiation date estimate, and this is how we estimated when birds were actually laying their first egg. So with wild turkey, they'll lay an egg a day, and then once they're done laying, they'll start sitting and incubating. So you can float eggs to determine how far along in the incubation cycle they are. So, you know, the top figure is about a 7 to 9 day old egg that's been incubated for 7 to 9 days. So if you monitor a wild turkey with a telemetry unit, and you know when she's starting to sit on a nest as she stops moving. So you can go about 2 weeks after you think she's been on a nest, you flush her off the nest once over that cycle, and then float the eggs, and then depending on the height of the float in the water, it can tell you how far along she is. So we can back calculate, so you can subtract whatever days, 15 days from when you first thought she was on a nest, and then estimate when she initiated her nest. So in 2019, we expanded the study to include a banding component. And this was really specific to getting at harvest rates, but also trying to get at population estimation. And I'll go into that a little bit more on a slide further down. But so basically, like waterfowl or other bird species, banding birds, and then getting recovery information for hunted species, it's convenient because hunters will report banded birds. There's contact information on each band, a website and a phone number, and folks report that when they register their bird, or they can call it in. This is the expanded study area after 2019, when we expanded it to include a banding component for males. You can see the banding was pretty expansive across kind of the central belt of Maine. We did have some banding up in Holton. The transmitter samples were focused on that study area I showed, and then southern Maine. But overall, we had 72 capture sites. Over the course of the study, we banded 893 turkeys and put transmitters on almost 200 birds, but that also included males. We were interested in looking at survival of males from capture to the hunting season to see if that was a significant enough measure that we needed to incorporate that into our population estimations. So we did put some GPS units on 2 tom turkeys, and this again shows that they're traveling across the landscape, you know, quite a distance. This is a 7-mile straight line, but you can see that this tom was captured here just north of the Bangor Mall. So this is in the urban study area, and wandered and transitioned over the course of March to May, you know, related to nesting and mating, and went all the way up here 7 miles away and then returned back to this site. And then this other tom did something, you know, similar, wandering and going to different places, likely related to mate selection and dispersal. So they're moving around quite a bit. This was one that we wasn't actually a radio telemetry unit on a bird. This was in the first year of the study in 2019. We did band some males, and we put a wing tag on a few different birds just to see if that was a useful method in tracking birds, and it likely would be informative if you put enough wing tags on birds. But we just happened to get a report 10 months later. This bird was captured over on the Stud Mill Road, which is in that forested habitat. And then 10 months later, got a call from a landowner. She had a sighting of one of the wing tags in her backyard. So that bird traveled 20 miles from capture site to 10 months later. So another good example of a lot of movement across different landscapes. This was from forested to urban and likely go back and forth. So good information for looking at district level management, wildlife management district level. So these are the things that banding can tell us. Like I said, we have a pretty robust spring harvest data set through registration. We can take that total harvest and then look at band reporting, and we can estimate a male population for that spring. I'll go into a little more detail on a further slide, but we can also look at harvest rates between toms and jakes, and then there's pretty substantial literature on what's a sustainable harvest level in wild turkeys. And our harvest rate is overall about 25%. It varies between toms and jakes, so adult males and juvenile males. Adult males are harvested at a higher rate, as most folks would expect. But overall, our harvest rates are within the realm of what's considered sustainable. We can also look at wildlife management district specific harvest rates to see if they vary across, and to see if we see any real differences that we should incorporate into our season setting and harvest management. And then, of course, with banding, like I showed you with the wing tags, we have dispersal, but we also have dispersal from banding site, capture site where birds are banded, to where they're reported in the harvest. And you can understand differences in dispersal from that information. We had some birds that were reported 18 to 20 miles from where they were captured in the wintertime to where they were harvested in the springtime. So, and a lot of that was crossing wildlife management district lines. So this is the sort of population estimating abundance in a nutshell. There's this really handy tool that a lot of folks use in mark recapture or banding studies that utilize what they call the Lincoln Estimator, and it's based on, you get good harvest registration data or harvest information. For Maine wild turkeys, it's spring harvest registration data, and we know the total harvest, and then we take our harvest rate from our banding, proportion of bands that are reported in the harvest from the total banded population, and we get an estimate of population size by year, wildlife management district, sex, and age that will inform our harvest management into the future. And this is something that we can do annually and monitor and track. Just some specifics for 2019. We had 6,612 birds reported in the harvest. About 20% of the banded birds that we put out that year were recovered or reported in the harvest. Birds banded and harvested. So that yielded us about 32,512 spring male population. So that's just half of the population. If you assume a 50-50 sex ratio, which in a lot of wild turkey literature, that's an accepted ratio, you can multiply that spring male population by 2 and get an estimate of a spring turkey population of 65,024 in 2019. And I have to always note that, I highlight spring in yellow because we have to keep in a perspective that our spring population is a lot different than our fall population. Our fall population includes all the reproductive success over the course of that breeding season. So your number is going to be a lot higher than 65,000. And so when folks say that we have a lot more birds than 65,000, well, we do in the fall, and then survival decreases over the winter time and a lot of other factors. So just when folks think of the turkey population, you have to think of it seasonally to really understand the population as a whole. As I mentioned in the study objectives, we wanted to understand disease and how that what role that has in our turkey population and how we can use that in estimating abundance and setting seasons, and it's an important component that we identified as something we need to consider. But I just wanted to go back to 2012. I know these pictures aren't as appetizing as some folks would like, but this is what we saw in 2012, 13, and 14. Was a lot of birds in different flocks with this, what they call lesions. And this was a learning curve for me and a lot of other wild turkey biologists. Because at the time, a lot of people didn't understand this other disease. This is actually pox most of the time. When I say most of the time, a small percentage of the time you can have a turkey that has a different disease, not pox. And it's important because this other disease, LPDV, which is somewhat of a compromising disease where it affects your immune system, can open up turkeys to a number of other diseases. And we found that in the study, at least from 2018 to 2020, we had a pretty high prevalence. 57% of the birds that we sampled, and we sampled hundreds of birds, have LPDV within their system. And it's not necessarily a death sentence, but it does contribute to some vital rates. And I wanted to note that the bird on the left with the yellow spots, lesions, was in 2010. And with pox, you see lesions on a bird's head. You think, oh, that's avian pox. And this bird actually didn't have pox. It had LPDV, or we think it had LPDV. We didn't ever tested it, but this is similar to a bird that was discovered down in the southern part of the U.S., but didn't actually have pox. It had this other disease. And so this bird on the right is a healthy looking bird and may be healthy, may not have the disease, but it could have this LPDV disease that can contribute to, negatively contribute to their survival. So we have to keep that in mind when we're considering disease in population management. So in terms of vital rates or sort of how it affects the population individually and as a whole, we did find that this LPDV infection reduced the number of eggs in a clutch. And also we found some prevalence of this other disease, REV, that actually contributed to the survival rates for some turkeys. So although it wasn't as prevalent as the 57% in LPDV, those birds that did have REV had a higher chance of, or a lower chance of surviving. So I also wanted to note that salmonella has been a topic of concern or perceived concern with wild turkeys and livestock, where folks have long thought that salmonella is carried throughout the turkey population, and wild turkeys spread it to other poultry and cattle and things like that. But just wanted to note that New Hampshire did a pretty extensive study in the early 2000s and found very low, if any, occurrence of salmonella. In Maine, we did a survey and assessment and sampling of turkeys around dairy farms and found very low occurrence in 2012 and through 2014. And then in this recent study, we also found a very low occurrence of salmonella. Although our sample sizes were lower, it just supports that salmonella and wild turkey, they don't go hand in hand. And that's important for perspective and acceptance of wild turkeys on the landscape. So just to kind of recap through that presentation, as I said, starting from that fossil record in 2 to 3 million years ago in North America, turkeys were native to the United States, but also native to Maine. There's a lot of evidence of wild turkey in burial sites and artifacts from pre-colonial times. By the late 1800s, turkeys were extirpated. They no longer existed in the state. There was a lot of effort in the 40s and through the 70s to restore wild turkeys. And finally, that trap and transfer and capture of live birds from other states brought to Maine equaled the success of restoration. They are now abundant in their core area of Maine and abundant in a lot of places across the country, although some states are actually experiencing declines in turkey numbers for a number of reasons, which is something we need to keep in mind. As we have an abundant population, we would like to maintain a sustainable population. And then a lot of this research that we did is one step in those publicly derived goals and objectives for the big game management plan going forward. And the goal is to maintain a sustainable turkey population and also promote them and inform people and promote and develop acceptance for turkeys on our landscape for the future. And all that data was collected for our turkeys specifically, that we can now move on to the next step, which is incorporating all this into our management program. I did want to shout out to landowners. As all of us know, in the state of Maine, most of the property is privately owned, and all of this work, most of this work, probably 95% of it, was done on private land, and we're indebted to the landowners that allowed us to conduct the research. And of course, I have to shout out to all of the people involved. This is probably a fraction of the folks that actually came out and helped us. But I do want to note that in the center of all this is Matthew Gonerman and Stephanie Shea. They're the two PhD candidates at the University of Maine that are really the data crunchers and the drivers of the study. Dr. Eric Blomberg is the advisor, as well as Dr. Pauline Kamath at University of Maine. So that's the core research team. So along with, I was part of it as well, but we had a lot of people participate, from University of Maine students to the sheriff's office down in Gray. You can see a number of people. The warden service participated, our regional biologists, and just have to say that a lot of this work, there was a lot of work and time and effort that people dedicated their time to, and we're thankful for that. And So now what's the next step? And I'll leave this slide as the last slide. Where do we go from here? We have a lot of good data, so we can inform our outreach efforts. We can improve our harvest management system and look at WMD specific regulations and management. Now that we have a good understanding of movement and harvest rates within WMDs or wildlife management districts. And then our system, our intention is, one of the intentions is to confidently provide fall hunting opportunity where it's allowable or where it's sustainable. The fall season is really the driver of the population. You're taking females out of the population that are prospective breeding component. So we have to be cautious and mindful of the level of take in the fall and make sure that we're not over harvesting, because that could lead to far fewer turkeys in the springtime and over time through the future. So the term adaptive management is going to apply to our efforts going forward. We're going to continually assess our turkey population. We're going to learn from what we find out, and then we're going to take that information and continually refine our harvest management system over time to sustain wild turkeys and also balance our use of it with the social acceptance, or what's coined social carrying capacity. And with that, thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Kelsey. So we did have some questions come in through the chat. And one of the questions that came through was, are the stock turkeys the same subspecies as the original native population?
So yes, same species. Yep, Eastern wild turkey.
Great, that was an easy one. And then somebody else asked, does LPDV make the turkeys unsafe to eat?
No, and I should expand on that. As long as you handle them safely and process them safely, cook them thoroughly, there's no concern for human health.
Great, thank you. And I know that Madison and Isabel are watching at home. They are actually sending me some messages, some questions, and they had quite a few, and I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, unfortunately, but I will ask a couple. So one of the questions that they had is, do turkeys in northern Maine have a higher mortality rate?
We didn't find a real difference between different regions of the state. There was one region that wasn't actually far northern Maine that did show a little higher survival, but in general they were pretty uniform across the state.
Great, thank you. And just a few more. How long do the telemetry units stay on the birds?
They'll stay on through their life cycle. Yep.
And a question actually that came through on Facebook was, why don't we start the turkey season earlier in the spring? People see birds out, they start to get excited about turkey hunting season. Why don't we start that season a little earlier?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a balance between making sure that we have a healthy, sustainable population without interfering with breeding. The earlier you start, the more males you take out of the population that there'll be fewer birds to breed when females are ready. The other thing too is that people on the landscape have potential for disturbance to nesting females and can contribute to failure of nests and reproduction. So having turkeys, having the season time for when most of the females are on nests, there's less likelihood of interference and disruption into the breeding process. So it's a fine balance, and we set the season on average. So you may, and in general, turkeys don't nest much earlier than any given year. Their nesting is more timed with the day length. So even if you have a warm April, if it was 75 degrees all of April, the females are keying into day length more than anything. So you could have a season where they nest a little bit early, maybe a week early, but we don't have the ability to predict that. So we manage for the average, and that's why we have our seasons where we do.
Great, thank you. And we're right at the hour here. So, we did have a question come in. How long does a turkey live?
That's a good question. I think on average, 3 to 5 years is an old turkey. They don't live very long.
Also pretty young. So I think we don't have a whole lot of questions coming in, and we're right at the hour. So I will ask one more question. We heard a lot of your birds making noise in there. What kind of birds do you have, Kelsey?
Oh, 2 parakeets and a cockatiel.
Definitely a bird enthusiast. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I want to thank Kelsey for being on the presentation this evening, and for everyone at home who was watching us. I want to encourage everyone to join us on April 14th. We're going to continue the spring presentation series. I'll be having Fish Cultural Supervisor Jamie Bray on to talk about fisheries and hatcheries and the stocking program, and that'll be at 6 p.m. So thank you again for everyone for joining us.